Welcome to the F.W. de Klerk Foundation's Constitution at Work podcast, where we discuss issues affecting the Constitution and our democracy. I am Daniela Ellerbeck, an attorney and the manager of the F.W. de Klerk Foundation's Constitutional Rights Program. Today, we are diving into the impact of President Trump's tariffs on the South African economy and the rest of the world. Joining me are my colleagues, Ismail Joosub.
Hi, everybody. My name is Ismail Joosub. I serve as the Manager of Constitutional Advancement at the F.W. de Klerk Foundation.
And Christo van der Rheede.
Good day, I'm Christo van der Rheede, the Executive Director at the F.W. de Klerk Foundation.
And also joining us is Sonia Twongyeirwe.
Hi everyone, I'm Sonia Twongyeirwe, an intern in the Constitutional Rights Program at the F.W. de Klerk Foundation.
Fantastic. Christo, to kick us off, we all know that President Trump has recently imposed 30% tariffs on South African exports to the American market. Now, hopefully we are going to discuss the opportunities that the current crisis provides for South Africa to focus on regional integration and becoming more self-reliant. Which South African sectors export to the American market, and how do these exports support employment? How do these exports support jobs?
Let me perhaps give a bit of context in terms of the trade relations between South Africa and the United States. We all know that South Africa and the US maintain significant bilateral trade relationships with both countries exporting goods and services to each other. In 2022, for example, the total two-way trade in goods reached approximately $18.3 billion. And this is significant. So South Africa is a key trading partner for the US, with the US being one of South Africa's top export destinations, and is also a major source of imports. So what are the major exports from South Africa into the United States? First and foremost, it includes a vast array of mineral resources, especially platinum, gold, diamonds, and those are the exports that South Africa will continue to export tariff-free, and that's very interesting. But we also export agricultural products such as citrus, wine, fruits, also ostrich leather, nuts to the United States. And we've now seen that the United States has imposed a 30% trade tariff on those goods. And then a very, very important export relates to our vehicles that we built in South Africa and that we export. And that imposes a significant threat to the motor industry in South Africa, because 30% trade hike on our manufactured goods, such as cars, will impact very negatively on the financial sustainability of factories in South Africa. We also then import a range of products from America to, or from the United States to South Africa. That includes machinery. I spent many years in the agricultural sector, so we've imported a lot of tractors, a lot of machinery, agricultural machinery, harvesters, drones. John Deere, one of the big manufacturers, are almost present on every farm in South Africa. There's a lot of vehicles that we also import, and we import chemicals and other products also from the United States. Currently, the Trump administration is of the opinion that South Africa has been favored one-sidedly, that the trade surplus is in South Africa's favor, that America has lost out, and that's why they've imposed a 30% trade tariff. But according to many leading economists, is that this calculations that the trade tariff is based on is wrong, and at the end of the day, it doesn't make sense. But South Africa is not the only victim of these trade tariff hikes. We know that a lot of countries throughout the world is now confronted with this trade tariff, and it will be interesting to see how this play out. But South Africa at this point in time needs to find ways and means to reduce the tariff hike, especially on agricultural goods, on cars and on other products that has been benefiting from the AGOA trade agreement, because if that tariff hike kicks in on the 1st of August, some of our sectors will be in serious trouble.
Ismail, what does a 30% US tariff on South African exports really mean for our economy?
Well, thank you very much, Sonia. I want to kick off my answer by saying this. I come from a family that's heavily steeped in the textile industry. And Christo makes a very valid point that now AGOA is in jeopardy and we can learn some cautionary tales from our neighbors. Now, when you look at the textile industry, the apparel industry, it saw tremendous growth under the AGOA incentives. I mean, South Africa's garment exports to the US are indeed still smaller than some of our neighbors. I mean, compared to Lesotho, whose textile industry is very heavily US focused. But still, a number of clothing factories in industrial zones were producing for American retailers. And these factories provide jobs, particularly for women in areas with very few other employment opportunities. So when we look at our neighbor Lesotho, we look at their very cautionary tale after the US slapped them with a 50% tariff hike. Up to 40,000 textile jobs in that industry were in jeopardy there. And we don't want the same thing happening to South Africa. But to directly answer your question, Sonia, a unilateral 30% tariff on all South African exports to the US is now effectively a 40% tariff if you include the 10% BRICS penalty for aligning with anti-American policies. And this would be an absolute economic thunderbolt for South Africa. It effectively ends preferential access South Africa enjoyed under AGOA. What it means is that there'll be export losses and company viability because many exporters will be priced out of the US. So an example of this is as follows. Take a South African built BMW or Mercedes-Benz or something that could compete for $50,000, practically R1 million, might now effectively cost some $70,000, 1.4 million rand, meaning US buyers and US automakers will simply switch to non-tariffed sources. South Africa's 37 billion rands in annual automotive exports to the US will dwindle. So without that US markets, Christo touched on the automotive industry, assembly plants may have to start cutting production. And cutting production has a number of consequences to our economy. But the second thing is that there'll be a job and income shock because fewer exports mean lower production and inevitable job losses. Let me give you some numbers. Going back to the automotive industry, that alone warns over 112,000 direct jobs and 350,000 indirect jobs might be in jeopardy if US demand collapses. And then the fourth thing is that, what does this mean for our GDP? Our GDP will certainly be hit by this because the US is one of South Africa's top trading partners. So this will be a crippling blow to the economy. There'll be also more pressure in terms of inflation. What does it mean for our currency as well? The rand would surely likely weaken. And then lastly, Sonia, to answer your question, investor confidence, right? Such a punitive tariff signals a deteriorating relationship with a major economic partner, and this really unnerves investors. The US tariff announcement has really shaken investor confidence, and now there's concerns about broader trade uncertainty in South Africa. So in essence, this 30% US tariff will really hit South Africa like a sledgehammer if not managed properly. What now needs to happen is that South Africa needs to navigate this very carefully and in a way that we can learn from the cautionary tale offered to us by our neighbor Lesotho.
Christo, you mentioned that one of the sectors that exports to the American market is the citrus industry. Now, the chairperson of the Select Committee of Trade and Industry, Honorable Sonia Joosub, is on record as saying that the citrus sector in South Africa supports more than 35,000 jobs. What does such a tariff mean for Joosub on the street? Will it affect vulnerable sectors or communities? Will it affect unemployment?
Let me also provide context in terms of agricultural exports. South Africa is divided into various agricultural regions. So in the Western Cape, you will mostly produce deciduous fruit and wheat. In the Eastern Cape, you will focus on wool. In KZN, sugarcane and other pineapples and subtropical fruit. In parts of Northwest, mostly meat, and Northern Cape, the same. Along the Orange River, you'll find a lot of raisin production, nut production. Then in Limpopo, mostly subtropical avocados, also a lot of macadamia nuts and other nuts, and also a lot of citrus. So the bulk of our agricultural produce goes first and foremost to Africa. We must know that 28% of our exports go to Africa, 30% goes to Asia, Europe 23%, and then approximately 8% goes to the United States of America. So we're relatively safe when it comes to a lot of our exports. It is the regions and the sectors that are dependent on exporting to America that will suffer. I know that the Citrus Dal area, which is a major citrus producing area, they export mostly to America. And the citrus that they land there will become more expensive if you add the 30% tariff and if you add the additional punitive 10% because of our South Africa being part of the BRICS Association. But what we need to understand is that there is a huge opportunity for us to open up new markets. But this is a tedious exercise. It takes years for one product, for example, apples. It took almost 10 years for it to be exported to Vietnam or to export to other parts of Asia. And that's why our Department of Trade and Industry, which is instrumental in terms of establishing new markets, should be much more proactive. We have been dilly-dallying for too long. We have made it very difficult to establish good relations with the rest of the world in terms of exporting. And we have rested on our laurels in terms of taking it for granted that the American market will be always available to us. And now we've seen with the Trump administration, it doesn't work that way. Whether we like it or not, Trump is on his own mission, obviously, to favor America and to make sure that America, the United States, become less dependent on energy sources from outside of the United States, less dependent on imports from China, and less dependent on anything else that comes from the rest of the world. And in that process, Trump hopes to obviously build its own economy, to create more jobs for the American people, etc. The problem is that it will take years for the American economy and the American business sector to mirror the kind of cheap production methods that China has been employing over the years. If they will ever get it right, that remains to be seen, because China has access to a large pool of cheap labor, a large pool of technology specialists. In America, there's a completely different work culture. And that in itself obviously poses a challenge to America. But coming back to South Africa, how do we make sure that we can avert a full-scale disaster in, for example, Port Elizabeth, where a lot of cars are being built, in Pretoria, where we have big manufacturers like BMW and Ford? Trump, a letter to South Africa, has indicated that South Africa may avoid, this type of punitive tariffs if American companies shift back to America from South Africa. That will even be more disastrous, because we have more than 600 American companies that create thousands of jobs, that bring a lot of investment to South Africa. And that's the big difference between the American model and the Chinese model. The Americans over the years have built factories in South Africa where currently we import the final goods from China into South Africa, which is not really benefiting the South African economy, because we need foreign direct investment. So yes, areas such as citrusal, maybe cereus, also other areas that has been, and even Oudtshoorn. Remember, Oudtshoorn is the capital, the ostrich capital. There we produce many thousands of ostriches, and we use the leather to create a lot of ostrich goods. We export the feathers. So those areas will suffer if we do not find a solution in due course.
Ismail, considering the potential negative effects that will befall South Africa if these tariffs were to come into effect, how prepared are we to absorb the shock? Should South Africa continue to diversify its trade partners?
I would make the argument that South Africa is not very well prepared to absorb a shock of this magnitude. Our economy simply has too little cushion left. And this is because of years of low growth and years of high employment. And now, with the recent global crises that we've been seeing, the COVID pandemic, disruptions in our supply chain, all of this means that we don't have strong enough buffers against this. Unlike larger economies, we lack deep stimulus funds and we don't have ultra flexible industries to easily relocate workers. And a point here is when the Minister of Finance was giving his first iteration and then second iteration of the budget speech, the one thing that he hoped he was able to do is put away some money for a rainy day. So it shows you there that we don't have deep stimulus funds left. Also, when you look at some of our industries and how inflexible they are, rather. You look at ArcelorMittal shedding jobs. I think we don't have the luxury of absorbing a blow like this because every job matters, because every export deal right now counts. And the reality is that a sudden loss of the US market hits us at a very vulnerable time. I mean, our manufacturing and agricultural sectors were expected to drive a modest recovery in 2025. Instead, now they're under massive risk. And I spoke about investor confidence already. So then to answer the second part of your question, Sonia, indeed, there must be a case for diversification. But I agree with everything Christo has said. Diversification is not an overnight measure. It takes time, it takes decades in some instances. And we've got to do it in a way that is both diplomatic and essential at the same time. Looking at diversification, looking at spreading our risks, I think what we must do is we must urge South African companies to accelerate diversification efforts so that they can become more resilient. And a sound diversification strategy looks like this. We need both market diversification, so that's new countries to trade with, but we also need product diversification. So we need more high valued or more varied exports. I think this is the multi-pronged approach that we should take. And we've got other options on the table. We can deepen our intra-African trade. I mean, on our own continent, in Africa, we can prioritize the African Continental Free Trade Area, which has been operational since 2021. It touches some 1.3 billion people. But we should also not turn our eyes away completely from other global markets. Here I mentioned India and China, also the European Union. Also, what we should do is we should move up value in the chain. So like I said before, export more value-added specialized products that are less price sensitive but have unique appeal. So instead of just the raw materials that we've been speaking of, export more finished jewelry, more components of bulk grapes, export premium wines, processed foods. This will buffer us for crises such as this. So yes, unfortunately, we are at this moment in time poorly prepared for the tariff shock right now. But if we do accelerate diversification, we can become more prepared for future shocks and hope that we don't fall into the same trap as some other countries who now have to navigate their way out of this.
Christo, could these tariffs and the crisis that South Africa faces as a result be the catalyst that we as a nation need to fast track our regional integration? I'm thinking specifically of the recently concluded Africa Continental Free Trade Area, as well as build our own economic self-reliance.
Well, we needed this wake-up call. On the one hand, it poses a serious threat to South Africa's economy, but on the other hand, it serves as a wake-up call. As you rightly say, this trade relationship between South Africa and the USA actually reflects a broader structural problem in the global trading system. We've been relatively self-sufficient in that we have, created value chains around commodities. But South Africa, since we liberalized our market, since we entered the global stage, we have become mere suppliers of raw materials. If you look at our manufacturing sector and how it has actually gone downhill over the years, it's shocking. How many big factories, steel factories in South Africa has closed down? We've recently heard about a big tire manufacturing sector, Goodyear in PE, Geberga, that is closing down. There's such a lot of big factories that created thousands of jobs for South Africans that are no longer in existence. One of the most shocking reports that I've seen is from the chrome industry. Remember, South Africa had a number of smelters. These smelters uses huge amount of electricity to turn chrome into materials for stainless steel and things like that. Most of those big smelters have closed down because of load shedding and because of all kinds of problems that we've seen over the years. So Eskom has had to, make do with less revenue because those smelters have been a huge, profit-making entities for Eskom. We've seen thousands of people losing their jobs and South Africa losing foreign exchange because we no longer export final products to the rest of the world. We export chrome in its raw form to China. China has now built the smelters. Our smelters have closed down, and we import our own stainless steel. We import our own steel. Our wool, our cotton goes to China and various other parts of the world. We import it as final products. You can go to any big retailer, you take something off the shelf, and you'll see made in China, made in this country, made in that country. And it also accounts for our commodities, agricultural commodities. Where it leaves the country, it comes back as a chocolate or a high value product. So we just have to, have to blame ourselves for the current state of affairs. So what are we talking about? We're talking about the fact that South Africa has become what we would call a price taker, instead of being part and parcel of the powerful economies out there and help create new rules. And at the same time, we've seen how our trade imbalances actually are reflective of an economy that's going nowhere slowly. So what do we need to do? We need to look at what are the factors that undermine the expansion of value chains, that undermine the creation of a small-scale manufacturing sector, that undermine the value that we can add towards our commodities in terms of manufacturing, industrialization, etc., etc. South Africa has one of the biggest phosphate mines in Phalaborwa. But from where do we import our fertilizers? We import it from Ukraine, we import it from Russia. A place like Sasol has been supportive of the process or the making of fertilizer for many, many years. But they rather sell their nitrogen to explosive companies as opposed to fertilizer making companies because they make more money. And that's the reality that we face. We've got all the ingredients to create a lot of products ourselves. And the agriculture sector is a shining example of us being a net exporter. What are the things that we import? Yes, rice and palm olive, because those are the things that our climate is not conducive for that. But we've got everything going for us. But we have been our biggest enemy because we have allowed the cost of production to become too expensive. And in the process, a lot of people lost their jobs, and we've lost our manufacturing capacity. And now we are facing huge constraints in terms of these tariffs that are being imposed on South Africa.
Christo, you mentioned cost of production. Please, can you identify some other factors that influence South Africa's creation of value chains?
Our big challenge, obviously, is productivity levels. Many of our workforces in South Africa are unionized to the extent that it undermines production. We have a labor legislation that is not very flexible, and it makes it difficult for anyone then to extract more value in terms of productivity. And obviously, there's factors such as availability of water, availability of electricity, and the cost of electricity, the cost of water, the cost of doing business in a municipality that is dysfunctional, the road infrastructure that is not at a standard that makes it difficult to transport things, our harbors that are not working, functioning properly. Remember, South Africa is not really, in a very good geographical position when it comes to trade routes. We're far out. It takes time for a boat to travel from China or from the USA to South Africa and back. And that's why we need to be at the leading edge, at the cutting edge in terms of addressing all of these factors that undermine investment, undermine the expansion of value chains, and that make it so costly. That's why people rather than say, okay, close down the factory, we rather import because it's cheaper.
Ismail, how should South Africa balance diplomacy with economic pragmatism in its response to the US?
Thank you, Sonia. I absolutely agree with Christo. I think the question that must be asked is, what economic advantage do we offer companies wanting to come and set up shop in South Africa is the one thing. But while we hold on to that thought and answering your question now, Sonia, South Africa really is walking a very difficult tightrope because on the one hand, we've got to firmly protect our economic interests and our constitutional principles, but on the other hand, we've got to minimize damage to the diplomatic relationship that we have with the US. And so this balancing act then means that we've got to engage in dialogue, in negotiation on the one hand, but also got to make some hard-nosed decisions to safeguard our economy on the other hand. And how do we do that? I think we must continue our diplomatic engagement with the US. We must always use diplomacy as our first resort. And here, President Ramaphosa's approach so far has indeed exemplified this. He has noted President Trump's correspondence, and he has instructed his team to urgently engage in negotiations. So I think it's important that we keep talking to the US at all costs. South Africa has already submitted a framework deal proposal in May to address US concerns about trade imbalances and practices. So pushing this framework in negotiations simply shows that we're still willing to make reasonable concessions or adjustments, perhaps like lowering certain tariffs on US goods, or improving market access in specific sectors in exchange for relief from the blanket tariff. So we must show that we're acting in good faith in this regard. But then also, we must be economically pragmatic. We must take protective measures for ourselves. While any negotiations or talks or diplomatic measures proceed, which could take a lot of time and may be very uncertain, South Africa must pragmatically protect its interests. And this could include the diversification we spoke of earlier, but also to diversify trade partners and to use legal tools where available. For instance, we could invoke the World Trade Organization mechanisms. And this would mean that the tariffs that have been placed on us by the US are probably likely to violate World Trade Organization principles if done outside of a national security exemption or such. Now, I mentioned this very briefly because in the letter that President Trump sent, he did mention that this is all done in the guise of being a national security threat for the US economy. So we take that at prima facie. But what we should do is we should really identify areas of compromise and then red lines for the South African economy. So what are some of the things that we can yield, and on what are some of the matters that we should stand firm? So for example, one of the US's concerns might be addressable. If the US wants lower tariffs on certain US goods, perhaps we can review those. Given our own applied tariffs average only some 7.6%, much lower than 30%, we have the data on our side to argue that we are quite open for this. And then we've got to really look at the BEE issue. Now, the US letter did not list political demands. It focused on economics, but it did imply things like South Africa should eliminate unfair practices and perhaps even hinted at our empowerment policies like BEE being obstacles. It hinted at that. So here we can balance this. While we can streamline and improve BEE, which we should be doing internally anyway, we likely should not exempt US companies from our laws or abandon our transformation agenda just to appease the US. This must be done because it is necessary to do so regardless. Lastly, we must then maintain a united and fact-based narrative. We should prepare for any outcome, a plan B and a plan C, and I think Christo has already touched on that, and I have too, on the diversification, looking at the AFCFTA and looking at BRICS as well. But finally, we must stay true to our constitutional values. Throughout, South Africa should make sure that its response adequately reflects our constitutional values. The rule of law, human rights, equality, all of this in turn really bolsters our moral high ground diplomatically. So by aiming to solve this lawful means, negotiation, World Trade Organization, and by striving to protect the most vulnerable in our society from the fallout, we must then practice what we preach, which is there embedded in our constitution. And I think if we do all of that, we should be able to find ourselves in a better position than what we're in currently.
Now, Christo, so far we have discussed the impact of the tariffs. What are the imperatives you think that are driving President Trump's tariffs, and how should South Africa respond in line with our constitutional values?
Perhaps let me start on the Trump administration side. Remember, the Trump administration has premised their response to South Africa on three building blocks, so to speak. The one is an economic building block. If you look at all the declarations that Trump has signed over the past couple of months since his inauguration, everything has to do with making America great again. And in the process, trying to limit America's spending. We've seen our Trump administration has cut back on aid programs, on their own federal government. We've seen how they have tried to lure companies back to America and to make America independent energy-wise and textile-wise, you name it. So there's a massive economic motivation for Trump to have imposed not tariffs only on South Africa, but on the rest of the world. And perhaps there's a lesson for us to learn, right? How do we also start taking care of our economy? And there's nothing wrong with it. Remember, it's a constitutional imperative. If you read our economy, if you read through our Bill of Rights, access to education, access to health, ensuring good nutrition for our children, making sure that we, if you look at Section 27, you look at all the other sections, undergirding all of those sections in the Constitution is an economic imperative, because you cannot realize the objectives of our national Constitution and the Bill of Rights if our economy is not growing, right? So how do we make sure that at the end of the day, there's a couple of lessons to be learned? And in the process, make yourself Trump resistant almost, and Trump safe. Because we've seen how Trump can, alternate the game and play the game to obviously benefit the American nation, and obviously to benefit his own political profile as well. So that's one of the there's an economic imperative that drives the Trump administration's agenda. The second one relates to a political agenda that is being driven. Obviously, and that agenda you can divide into perhaps 2 or 3 different scenarios. The first scenario related to South Africa is obviously going to the World Court and lay a case against Israel. And for the American administration, that is not, something that they support. And obviously, they want to punish South Africa. And then obviously, there's a lot of other, in other words, there's a global political agenda. And secondly, Trump sees South Africa's being part of BRICS and BRICS formation as a threat to America. So that is a second political agenda. And thirdly, we've seen how Trump has used the Afrikaner issue and embarrassing South Africa in the Oval Office. And what the reason for that is, I'm not sure. Who sits behind it, I'm not sure. But that is an agenda that we cannot ignore because Trump has exposed it in front of millions of people. So how do we deal with that? And then it comes back home in terms of what is the political imperatives that are espoused by the Constitution. And those political motivations you find in the 3 cornerstones of the Constitution. The one cornerstone or building block that speaks to human dignity. How do we address the human dignity of our people, of all of our people? How is it possible that people can come into your house and come and kill you? We've seen the gang warfare. We've seen the exposure by the police commissioner in KZN about murderous gangs, drug trafficking gangs, mafia that has infiltrated the judiciary, the correctional services, the various law agencies in South Africa. How does that contribute to the realization of the objectives embedded in our Constitution? Secondly, it talks about equality. How do we create an equal society? But we impose all kinds of legislation, all kinds of requirements that undermine that objective. And in our pursuance of trying to impose all kinds of legislation, we do not address the real ills. The real ills relate to a society that becomes more and more unequal. That's the sad thing. Over the 30 years, we have done everything in our power to take away from one community to give to the other. But the end game is more poverty, more inequality. So is that the right route? Instead of taking away and cutting the cake into smaller pieces, why don't we focus on growing the cake, addressing the fundamental issues such as property rights, securing property rights, expanding property rights to create wealth in the process, investing more money into infrastructure development as opposed to giving people grants. I said the other day, move away from basic income grants to basic employment grants. It's through giving people employment that you restore dignity. And then, last but not least, the whole issue of human rights and freedoms. We've been hailed as a country that has a constitutional democracy that other people can just dream of. Sadly, though, we have become hostages of a society that has become less free. And we've seen all kinds of attempts to centralize power as opposed to making sure that power is devolved to community levels where communities can take charge of their own destinies. So, as I've said earlier, there's an economic lesson to be learned. There's also a political lesson to be learned, and there's also a very important, a lesson in terms of diplomacy that we can learn. And obviously, diplomacy is almost overarching when it comes to, on the one hand, political and economic.
I absolutely agree with you, Christo. And I think there's a duplicity to my answer on this question, sort of a contrast, because there's a domestic aspect and there's a diplomatic aspect. And I think diplomatically speaking, when looking at the way South Africa has handled this specific economic tariff crisis, one can argue that our response has been to strive to uphold the rights that are enshrined in the Constitution. But I can't shrug off what you said, Christo, about domestically us making sure that, the Constitution isn't just words on paper. It isn't just something that you preach. It must be practiced. And I go back to what I said earlier about not just having economic advantage for companies wanting to come into South Africa and invest here, but are we really living up to the ideals of the South African Constitution insofar as ordinary South Africans are concerned? And there are a number of issues that highlight that we're not. When you look at the safety and security that's now come under the spotlight after the allegations made by the KZN police commissioner, you ask yourself whether people, and especially the most vulnerable, are safe in a society. Do they have enough dignity? If they're not given a job, certainly you don't have enough dignity. So there's a lot to be done from a domestic aspect, in my point of view, before we can truly be the shining model that will attract investment to South Africa. If we are then just to look segmentedly at the way we've handled the current US fiasco, then, as I mentioned earlier, I would argue that indeed our response has been to strive to uphold the values of the Constitution. And we've done this firstly by our fight has been to protect jobs and livelihoods. So the government has affirmed in that regard the constitutional value of human dignity and the right to work, to freedom of occupation, trade and profession, Section 22 of the Constitution. I mentioned our Constitution is not just a legal document. It's a promise to improve the quality of life for all and to free everyone's potential. So when President Ramaphosa and others emphasize that every job matters and that we cannot afford any further job losses, what they were doing in essence is echoing the spirit of the Constitution. Secondly, I think our response thus far has indeed been grounded, specifically now when looking at our response to the US, it has been grounded in fairness, in evidence, in the rule of law, and reflecting the constitutional value of accountability. I mean, South Africa immediately challenged the basis of the tariff on factual grounds. We asserted that the 30% figure is based on a contested interpretation of trade. And so this also falls in line with a commitment to due process and truth. And I think additionally, our emphasis has always been not just as the government, but as civil society in general and as the people in general on human rights, on solidarity. We've always echoed and maintained that the real impact of these tariffs will be felt by ordinary people. And in that, we are voicing the value of Ubuntu, the value of human solidarity that really underpins our constitution. But that all really doesn't mean much if it doesn't change the livelihoods of ordinary South Africans on the ground who need the constitutional promise to be realized for them as soon as possible.
Thank you, everyone. And that's it for today's episode of The Constitution at Work. A huge thank you to Christo and Ismail and Sonia for joining us and for sharing your respective insights on the impact of President Trump's tariffs on South Africa and how South Africa can diversify and become more self-reliant. To our viewers and listeners, if you found this conversation valuable, please like, subscribe, and leave a review, and share it with someone who cares about the future of our democracy. Thank you for listening.